It's never dull. It's never dull. Have any of you ever been to a marriage seminar, marriage enrichment? Ever been to one of those? Yeah. I don't know if you heard Ole and Lena, my favorite Norwegian couple. Ole and Lena were at a marriage seminar dealing with communication, how to be better communicators with one another. And the instructor there at the seminar said, she said, it is essential that husbands and wives know each other's likes and dislikes. That's really important. Know your husband or your wife's likes or dislikes. And then she looked at Ole. And she said to Ole, she said, do you know your wife's favorite flower? And Ole smiled, and he leaned over and he laid his hand gently on Lena's arm, and he leaned over and he said, it's Pillsbury, isn't it, dear? Ole didn't know. He didn't know. Do you know? Do you know what you believe? Do you know what you believe? Wednesday night, I was walking out of the chapel, had some business here, and I walked out, and there was a guy standing in front of the sign right out here. The black sign that lists all the chapels. And he was standing there kind of looking at the sign, and he was kind of weaving a little bit. And I thought, And so I walked up and I introduced myself. I'm Pastor Scott. And he said hi, and whew, he'd been to one of our libation stations. Okay, and I introduced myself. I said I'm Pastor Scott, and he looked at the sign and he looked at me and he goes, "What brand are you?" and then he asked, "What do you believe in there?" I told him I was Lutheran, and he said, "Well, what's a Lutheran? And what do you believe in there?" And I thought, well, that's an interesting question. It's Wednesday night. You're walking out of the chapel, right? And you're asked, what do you believe in? What would you say? What would you say to the man? I mean, the Apostles' Creed? Not exactly something you recite, after dark on a Wednesday night on the sidewalk. Jesus is Lord? Well, yes. But what does that mean exactly to a man who's had too much to drink? That in spite of all appearances to the contrary, God's world is in good hands? Well, really? Says who? Have you read the paper? Ukraine, Gaza, Israel? What do we believe in here? And does it make any difference? In our gospel this morning, Jesus himself is the man out on the sidewalk. He's the one asking the question about what it all means. What he means. He's curious. He wants to know what the disciples think. He's been preaching and teaching and healing all over the place. And now it's time for a little show and tell. And so he asked the disciples, what are folks saying? Who do people think that I am? And the disciples, their hands immediately, they jump into the air, and Andrew says, "Oh, some say you're John the Baptist." And Bartholomew shouts out, No, some say you're Elijah. And Philip cries out, "You're Jeremiah." And Judas says, "Oh, you're one of the prophets." Not a lot of personal risk here. They're all repeating the things that they've been hearing, reporting about what others have said. Well, that's all really interesting, says Jesus. But now I'm curious. What say you? Who do you say that I am? Which is another way of asking, what do you believe in there? What do you believe in there? And I can imagine that there was this long pause. And Philip kind of looked at his fingernails. And Bartholomew, well, he, with the toe of his sandals, he started playing in the dirt, making these little piles in the sand. And Andrew, look at those birds. Look at that flock of birds go overhead there. And Judas, Judas, would you look at the time? My. No one said a thing. And I don't know how long the silence lasted, but finally it was Peter who spoke up. And Peter said, "You're the one. You're the one we've been waiting for. You're the chosen one." Now I say thank goodness for Peter. Right or wrong, he's always the first one out of the gate. He's the first one to leave his fish nets and follow Jesus. And he is the first one to get out of the boat and walk on the water. Sometimes, watching Peter, sometimes you don't know if he's just being reckless or if he's being courageous. But in either case, this time he gives the answer which apparently is the one that Jesus was looking for. Because in one fell swoop, Jesus calls him blessed. Jesus says that he's going to be the rock upon which the church is going to be built. And he says, you're going to be the inheritor of the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Sort of makes me want to have my own answer ready. Just in case, I get asked the $64,000 question. But if you read the rest of this passage, which we'll get next week, 6 lines later, Peter stumbles all over himself. No sooner is he praised by Jesus, given authority, given the keys to the kingdom of heaven, then Peter starts to argue with Jesus. You remember? Jesus says, "I'm going up to Jerusalem. I'm going to be handed over to the Sanhedrin. I'm going to be scourged. I'm going to be beaten, and there's a cross on a hill with my name on it." And Peter begins to argue. "God forbid it, Lord. There's got to be another way." And Jesus says, do you remember? "Get behind me, Satan, for you're putting a stumbling block in my way." Now, my question is, how can Peter be the rock with the right answer and the devil in the way at the same time? And if he is, then what in the world are we supposed to learn from him? I mean, I'll be honest, it's almost impossible to squeeze some kind of moral lesson out of this story or to find some model for our own behavior. Fact is, Peter is impulsive and he's opinionated. And when push comes to shove in the Garden of Gethsemane, he denies that he knows Jesus at all. About all we can say in favor of Peter is that he's willing to go first, he's willing to speak his mind, and every time he falls down, he gets back up again, brushes himself off, and he charges on ahead. The other disciples all hang back for fear of giving the wrong answer. But Peter risks his own answer, which, lo and behold, turns out to be God's answer. And sweet music in Jesus' ears. "You are Petros," says Jesus, making a pun, right, in his native tongue. "And on this Petra, I will build my church." It's the same word used twice. First in the masculine form and then in the feminine form. The word for rock. Jesus said, "You are the rock, and on this rock I will build my church." But there's a subtle difference between the two words. Petros, the name that Jesus gives to Peter, means a small pebble, a small piece of a much larger rock. While Petra means a boulder, the mother lode, A great block of stone. Which makes Peter then a chip off the old block. Huh? A piece of the rock against which the powers of death will never prevail. You see, it's not what he is, or what he says, or what he does all by himself that wins him the keys to the kingdom. Peter is blessed because his answer is God's answer. He's a piece of, he's a chunk off the rock of ages. Peter is chosen not because the right answer has occurred to him. On the contrary, the right answer has occurred to him because he's chosen. Because Jesus, in his unsearchable wisdom, in his inscrutable mystery, decides to pick a bull-headed, big-hearted, fallible, stubborn, never say never rock upon which to build the church. Now, I don't know what you think about that. Peter is not he's not a flawless character. He doesn't have the intellectual profundity or the spiritual depth that I might prefer in a founder of the church. But I'll tell you this, I am really glad to hear that he is the one in charge of the gates in heaven. Why? Because someone like him might just understand someone like me. Sometimes I don't have all the answers. And I find any kind of answers hard to come by. Sometimes I find it easier and safer to repeat other people's answers. Either because I haven't thought about my own or because I don't think mine are good enough. Or because I don't trust God to help me find the answers. Peter's the kind of disciple who understands someone who goes ahead and says things and then regrets them later. You ever done that? Anybody ever not done that? Or who makes promises, remember Peter at the Last Supper, even though everyone else denies you, I'll stay with you. And then in the garden, he's the first to run. I don't know the man. Never seen him before in my life. If Peter is the rock upon which the church is built, then there's hope for us. All of us. Because he's one of us. He remains God's chosen rock, whether he's acting like a cornerstone or acting like a stumbling block. And I find great hope in that. Peter is blessed. And he shows us that blessedness is less about perfection and more about a willingness to take a risk. To go ahead and try. To get up one more time and then we fall down. And do you remember that last encounter that Peter has with Jesus? It's after Easter. Jesus is risen from the dead. They're on the beach there on the Sea of Galilee. And Peter's been out fishing and it's Jesus, and he jumps out of the boat and he swims to shore, and it says that when the disciples arrive, Jesus is fixing breakfast there on the beach. And after breakfast, Jesus says to Peter, he says 3 times, "Do you love me? Do you love me?" And 3 times Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And 3 times Jesus says the same thing. What does he say? Do you remember? Feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. Do you know what that tells me? It tells me that the final answer Jesus is looking for from those who love him is not so much an answer that is spoken as much as it is one that is lived. Jesus doesn't say to Peter, "All right, go out and tell them what you believe." He says rather, feed them. feed them. In other words, the real truth about who He is for each of us shows up not so much on our lips. It does show up there, but not so much on our lips, but in our lives. So, the next time you go walking out of the chapel and there's somebody standing there by the sign, maybe they're weaving a little bit, maybe they're not, and they ask you a question, and you realize that in the asking of the question that your answer is going to matter. It's going to matter. When that happens, give it a try. Invite them through the doors and say, let me show you what it means to be a Lutheran. Let me show you. Ask them to join us on Thursdays to help serve that meal down at the Edwards Chapel. All right? Tell them about Rainbow Trail Day Camp and all of those kids that got introduced to Jesus this year. Invite them on September 7th, after the Breeden Creek service, to help us put together those baskets, those care baskets for the 42 hospice nurses and their assistants here in the Eagle Valley for God's Work Our Hands. Share with them the story about Emily Ewing, who was ordained yesterday to Word and Sacrament. The first person from our congregation, 45 years and counting, who's been called into the ministry, who has answered the call, and is now going to South Jordan, Utah. Tell them her story. Tell them about all of the AA and Al-Anon groups that are sponsored by this congregation that meet every single day of the week. Tell them about our prayer chain. Tell them about the prayers that have been answered. And when you're done telling them about that, then tell them your story. Tell them about what God has done for you. Tell them about the times God has blessed you. Tell them about the hardships that God, where God's been with you, and how God has helped you to endure. Tell them. You may say something that doesn't sound quite right, but you also may say something that sounds and feels absolutely inspired. The important thing is to try. Not only to say what it is that you believe, but also to live what you believe. Remembering all the while that you are relatives of St. Peter. And whether we rise or whether we fall, whether we give the right answer or the wrong one, we're chips off the old block. All of us. Pieces of the one true rock against which the very powers of death can never prevail. Pastor, how do you know that? Because Jesus promised. And Jesus never, ever breaks His promise.